Hello gardeners and plant people, how are you guys doing today? If you're new around here, my name is Ashley and I'm a soil scientist. On this channel I like to take that science and usually apply it towards gardening and plant care. But in today's episode we are doing a creepy crawly video all about the Dust Bowl. And as a soil scientist you can probably understand my excitement about this video. So we're just gonna jump straight into this video and just get down into the nitty-gritty. If you're new, the Creepy Crawly series, I kind of go over creepy plants, black market, odd forests, just all that sort of stuff. Historically odd things that have happened, and the Dust Bowl is pure soil. So it's a creepy soil scientist's dream. Contrary to what the history books say, it wasn't a single factor in a lot of cases that caused the Dust Bowl to happen. It's a multitude of different things. First off, it wasn't the entire 1930s that was a massive drought. It was actually very specific years in a lot of cases. Some areas were hit by drought for the whole decade, but for the most part, it was 1934, 1936, and the year of 1938. And when we say drought, we mean less than 10 inches of water. So they say it was the drought and poor farming practices, but I'm a little bit cynical about the whole poor farming practice part of this. I want you guys to put yourselves in the boots of the beginner farmer. Imagine trying to start a garden with no machinery and just your bare hands in your front lawn. What's your first step? Remove the lawn. And that's what they did, because that was literally the only option. So yes, the removal of the grasslands caused the Dust Bowl, but calling the farmers dum-dums or saying that they used poor farming practices to make that happen is just ridiculous, because you have to have the dirt exposed in order to grow anything. So poor farming practices is a very loosely used term in this video. So to remove this matte layer of grass, they actually use something called a deep plow, and I'm going to insert a video of what this piece of machinery would have looked like. It would have been pulled by ox and such, or cows, or whatever they used, but in the 1930s, it would have been pulled by a tractor, for example. So this is generally what that piece of machinery looked like. They were very big knives, and what those knives did is they dug down and they chopped up the roots and they removed that top layer of sod. The land area that this was done in was known as the short grass brome biome, and this biome, back then they didn't know this, but this biome is notorious for drought seasons combined with flood seasons. So this is also known as not agricultural friendly land, especially when it comes to growing crops. Maybe if we're doing like a cattle grazing scenario, of course, but growing crops, especially crops that need lots of water, not a good mix. The Europeans, when they came and found this patch of land, actually referred to it as the American desert. So yeah, to put that in perspective, it was very dry. And when the Europeans did find it, they actually deemed on a map, they circled it off as a place where we are not doing ag at all. It would not, in their minds, would not be able to sustain the very classic, typical European form of farming. And they knew that when they came over, and they just did not utilize it. People who now work in this area of North America, whether that be in Canada or the US, actually do a mix of grain and cattle, and there's very good reason for this. The reason why they need multiple sources of income is if they have a crop failure one year, then they can actually import the feed for the cattle, or if they have a bumper crop, they still have the cattle to rely on. So that is kind of what is happening in that area now. This area is also very notorious for irrigation, and so a lot of these places, a lot of these farms who are growing crops mainly will have some sort of irrigation system set up to buffer those drought seasons. To this day, there's very little rain in that area. I actually have 2 coworkers that are from that area. I have a friend that lives in that area, and it is notoriously dry. There is an area in Saskatchewan called Grasslands National Park and Big Muddy, both of which I have visited, and they look like a desert, literally like a desert. It's still like that to this day. They just didn't know it back then when they initially started settling the area. They had no idea that this was a problem. But now, after decades of data and lots of research, we have enough info to be able to form our own conclusions around it. And the conclusion is this area just goes through cycles. So because we lifted off that mat with our deep plows and we had very little rain, we end up with the black blizzards of the 1930s, of the dirty 30s. And those black blizzards caused an enormous amount of topsoil loss. And anyone who's in soil science knows that the most valuable portion of your land is actually the topsoil, because it is the most nutrient rich. And because there's nothing to hold that soil in place, what ended up happening is it ended up literally blowing into the sky. These black blizzards were so thick that in a lot of cases you couldn't even see 3 feet in front of your face. The cost economically of this to the United States alone was $100 million, which in today's money, moolah, is $460 million loss. So that is how much land was ruined in these years. So why? Why did this happen? Why would the American government put settlers in an area that was deemed by the Europeans as not agriculture friendly? There's a reason. It's the cycles. When the Americans decided to start putting settlers in the area, they made a Settlers Act, and that was called Homestead Act. The Homestead Act was made in 1962 and ran until like 1969. Oh no, it went a little bit further. Yeah, anyways, it was called the Homestead Act, and in the Homestead Act, they moved settlers out there when it was a time of heavy rain and lush growth. So everyone saw it as a huge deal and they just moved in. You have to understand that the time when the Homestead Act was actually made was a time after a great amount of turmoil. The Civil War had just ended, so there was a lot of men and women that were just looking for a much quieter lifestyle. Combined with the addition of the Transcontinental Highway, which meant better access to trade ports in the area, it seemed like a meal deal, especially with how much rain and how much growth was in that area at the time. But as we know now, it was a bad idea because it's a boom-bust biome, and they moved in the boom, but the bust literally followed very shortly after. The early settlers in 1860s were mostly farming livestock, but the first bust actually hit literally 10 years after they had moved into their homes. And it started with a very harsh winter that actually put quite the dent in the livestock population. Cold and livestock mix only when there isn't a ton of snow. If there's a lot of snow, those animals can't get to their food and they end up starving. Or if it's very, very cold and there's not enough shelter for them, then they tend to freeze to death. So the first bust was actually in the winter. That was followed up very shortly after a few years with a drought. And this drought did not cause the Dust Bowl, surprisingly. And this is actually because of the livestock factor. Because these early settlers were so livestock heavy and put very little effort into actually cultivating and putting crops in the ground. This was mostly due to the fact that there's no mechanical machinery yet. We're still doing a lot of this stuff by hand. And so we had that mat in place. However, that mat was heavily fed on by livestock, and the drought combined with heavy feeding resulted in very little vegetation. Because we had the root mat, the soil didn't fly, but the cattle did starve, and so settlers after that decided to change the tactic and go more towards growing veg. And the reason for the growing veg was because if they had another drought season where they couldn't feed the cattle, then at least they would have something in the ground that may grow out of the soil. And then we began ripping it up, which is the beginning of the end for this whole story. To make matters worse, we switched from livestock to conventional farming. We're starting to rip up that root mat that kind of kept all that topsoil in place. And then the American government came along with the 1909 Homestead Act, would actually increase the number of acres a settler could get from 40 acres to 160 acres per family. And conveniently, the 1906 Homestead Act was also put in place in a boom, because you have to remember a decade before that was a bust. So it's a very cyclical area, and we ended up with a ton of moisture and a ton of growth, and all that growth meant a bust was coming soon. So we have our boom, and then we also have, in the 1909 area, we have the advent of machinery, steam engine tractors, and ability to pull bigger implements, all that stuff. Less manual labor, less humans needed, and so more land was cultivated than what had previously been ripped up. So we ripped off more of the root mat. Now we combo that with the 1918 era World War I time frame, where one of the best jobs to have was a farmer, because food meant money. So now we have even more people trying to get into farming because food meant money. And then we start ripping up more land because that makes us more money. But then we had a problem in the whole ripping up the land. Yeah, we had these big plows to tear out the root mass and give us some nice topsoil, but then we have these trees. So what did they do? They started ripping out the trees. What they didn't know is that those trees actually had a hydrological factor to their soil moisture. So trees are kind of like a sink for water. And so when you have trees, you have more water in your soil. When you rip the trees out, you tend to lose a little bit of water, not only around the root mass area of the tree itself, but because of the amount of wind that's able to plow through the area that actually dries the topsoil out. So the trees acted like a shelter belt, is what we would call those now. We ripped those out because they were in the way for making money. My other favorite thing that we did is we burnt all our stubble. And the reason for burning all our stubble is because we hadn't invented harrows yet, which is something we do use today to remove the stubble from the surface of the soil to make it easier for seeding the next year, to reduce disease, and also to reduce weeds. In a lot of cases too, you actually need to manipulate the ground in some cases. So we burnt it. And when we burnt our stubble, we again literally lost another factor that actually captured the snow. So we have wind that's able to blow across the landscape with no interruptions from trees. That will take off the topsoil and dry it out. Now we lost the stubble and the trees, which acted as snow catches, which again would add moisture to the soil. We've gotten rid of that as well. So we have very barren land with very little insurance on our hydrological cycle and ensuring that we have water in the area. So we messed up our hydrological cycle. We ripped off that top the map of roots, which honestly, it had to be there. We can't farm on grass, so it had to go. And then we continually deep till every single year before we seed. And the reason for the deep tillage when they did that was, again, it was weed control. That was purely what they were doing. So they weren't just being silly. They were actually trying to control their weeds, is why they did that. It's the same reason why you rototill your garden every year. Technically, you're doing what our settlers did, and you're doing what caused the Dust Bowl, but on an obviously much smaller scale. So yeah, that's what they're doing. You can't totally blame these farmers for this whole thing. I mean, they didn't have a lot of options. It's very rudimentary technology back then. So then we get the Dust Bowl, and we get the clouds, and we get the dust. So what was the solution? What was the fix to this? And there's a few fixes that did come through, brought to you by soil scientists themselves, very early soil scientists. I can tell you there's probably no redheaded females in that group, because if there was, it never would have happened to begin with. I'm just kidding. Number 1, crop rotation. This is something that still is very prevalent in today's world. Crop rotation is very important. When we rotate our crops, we prevent disease. If we prevent disease, that means we have crops that grow every year. If we have crops that grow every year, it means we are able to shield that topsoil from blowing away in the wind. And that is solely the purpose of crop rotation. The second one is strip farming. And if you've ever been in an airplane or you've ever seen an aerial shot of Saskatchewan, for example, or if you've even driven by, you will notice the strips where it looks like everything's planted one direction and then planted the other. There's a purpose to that. When we have alternating strips of crops, it breaks the wind up and how the wind actually moves through the soil and over the top of the soil profile, which conserves moisture and again reduces the amount of water loss. Contour plowing, and this one's really interesting. What they do, and they still do today, is instead, if you have a hill, instead of just going up the hill and then down the hill and then up the hill and then down the hill when we're seeding, we actually seed perpendicular to the hill. So we would seed this way, then this way, and then this way, and then that way. And that was actually a method that was invented during the Dirty 30s. And the reason for that is for when the water runs down, we're able to catch, but also the way that the tillage equipment moves the soil. So when we do have to till a little bit still, but when we seed perpendicular to a hill, we aren't pushing everything to the bottom of the hill and leaving the tops very barren and soilless, lifeless, if it basically is what it is. The next one is $1 for every single acre that a farmer decided to not till. And this was actually by the government and is still used today, but the farmers don't get compensated for it anymore. I don't think they do. I should ask, but no-till is very huge. All the machinery that's been made to up until today is made with the zero-till in mind, and that's actually what it's called. And I'll insert a photo of what this equipment looks like. So essentially it's a knife that goes into the soil. Behind the knife, there's like little hole openings, and in those hole openings, we're applying fertilizer and a seed. Whatever fertilizer that is, it could be liquid, gas, or granular. And it just goes, the knife cuts into the soil and it drops the seed in, and then a packer comes behind that and it packs down that trench. It'll put that trench back together. There's no such thing as deep plows going in and ripping it up. There are disc equipment, but that's a whole other topic that I could do a whole other video on. But for the most part, we're just using a single knife that is only big enough to be able to drop the seeds in, and that is it. So unforeseen issues that came with the Dirty 30s and the methods that we put in place. And some of these we're still just starting to realize today. I think some people have put their finger on it, but would you change your method to end up with the same situation, or would you just kind of sacrifice some yield to ensure that your topsoil doesn't blow away? That's kind of, it depends on what you want. You know, you might get a few good years if you change things up, but do you want to risk a drought season where things can go hairy-carry again? A lot of people don't. The first one is straw buildup, and this is more common with some crops than others. Some straw breaks down, some crop straw doesn't, and to this day, some crops do need to be burned, one of which is actually flax. So flax straw does need to be burned. It's usually burned in the winter, early spring. It's regulated, they're allowed to do it. But because of crop rotation, it doesn't happen every year on the same patch of land all the time. And then we have the harrows now. So the harrows actually displace and move the combine straw around the field to make it a little bit more even for when it comes to plying. But still have straw buildup. So that is one factor, but it's very minor in the grand scheme of things. The next two are a little bit more serious. The first one being pesticide usage, because we have herbicides. We now have herbicides that we didn't have before, and the purpose for the herbicides is to prevent weeds from growing. And the weeds that grow in a lot of cases can be controlled through tillage. So ripping up that root mass or ripping up the land would actually in many cases get rid of the weed issue. But because we're in no-till world now, we don't want to do that. So we have the advent of herbicides, and the herbicides are being used very heavily, and herbicides are used in some cases to make genetically modified crops like Roundup Ready canola, for example. So that's canola, that's a plant that has been genetically modified to be able to withstand a herbicide, and you plant it and then you can round up your field. So you just spray Roundup on your field and it kills off all the weeds except for the crop that you planted. So herbicides are an offspring of the dirty 30s and the no-till method. Fun fact, organic farmers do till. In some cases, depending on the type of weed, they are professionals. They hire agronomists. They hire me to go out and look at their fields and tell them what weed method that they should use to control. And tilling is a method that organic farmers do use to control plants. And the last one, probably the most interesting one that I myself have experienced, is hard pans. And essentially what these are is they're literally cement layers. They're cements, pretty much rudimentary form, where the roots hit and then they grow outwards, or the water hits and then goes outwards. And this is caused from compaction because we're not rototilling and moving the land up, but also because we don't have those grassy biomes with the giant root masses on them. Like I'm talking grassland, like fescue roots go literal meters into the ground. We don't have that on the surface anymore. We don't have the tillage anymore, so we're getting hard pans. And the hard pans are the combination of no roots, no till, combined with very heavy machinery. And when I say hard pan, I mean you need a pickaxe, literal pickaxe, to hack away at these soil profiles to even get any farther. So I've seen soil profiles dug with backhoes, like actual machines have to dig this stuff out to even get a look at what's going on. So that is an unforeseen issue that has come from no-till. So I don't know, jury's out. What do you guys think? Do you think it was the farmers being dum-dums and using poor agricultural practices, or do you think it was just a necessary evil that we didn't realize would happen? I think it was definitely the wrong place to be putting agricultural land, and I think even today we still realize it's a very poor placement for agricultural land, to the point that the current day farmers definitely have changed up their game when it comes to farming this area. I think that the removal of the fescue and the grassland was definitely necessary to plant anything in that area. However, I do think the removal of the trees was probably a poor choice. You couldn't have made that much more money off of it, but that may be just me. I know in Canada and Saskatchewan, we did have a shelter belt organization that was actually just dismantled here not too long ago. I think, was it done by the PRFRA? If there's anyone who farms that actually remembers that, I'm too young to remember that. But leave it down in the comments below. It was an actual group of people that you could get trees from to put shelter belts in place. Fun fact is the machinery is actually getting bigger and bigger every year. So we are slowly ripping out the shelter belts that were built in the 1930s to help prevent erosion. We have started pulling out of the ground and burning in a lot of cases to fit 100-foot implements in. So we're going a bit backwards, but whatever. So there's that. The burning of the stubble, again, I think that was a necessary evil. We hadn't invented harrows yet. We needed a form of weed control. There was no such thing as herbicides. So while it did do damage, it didn't act as a snow catch. It allowed the wind to just kind of rip across the surface of the soil. I think it was a necessary evil. It's a poor farming practice now, yes, but then it was their only option. I think it is important to note that organic farming, in a lot of cases, they do have to use these methods for herbicide control. An organic way of maintaining herbicide or weeds. If you think about your garden itself and what you do, you're digging when you're getting rid of dandelions, you're tilling to get rid of hard, compact areas, you're raking the surface of the soil constantly to get rid of weeds. So that's just the reality. If you're not using chemicals and mechanical, or you have to use mechanical manipulation, that's your only option. There are some unforeseen issues with like the hard pan and stuff like that, but I think that will be a future discussion. Probably like, I'm thinking like 10, 20 years down the road, we're probably gonna have a talk about that, and we're gonna have to find new technology to alleviate the farmers' woes when it comes to that sort of thing. I know if you guys are interested, because I actually work in this industry, there's a Selford vertical till machine, it's called, and it's a tillage machine, which is a disker blade, and I can do a whole video on diskers and like what they do, why they do it. But what the Selford vertical tillage machine does is it actually has plates that kind of rattle, and they fracture the soil vertically as well as perpendicularly. So the vertical till machine is supposed to alleviate like any hard pan compact issues without turning the soil up and losing that moisture control from compaction. It's just fracturing the soil sideways is the theory, while also maintaining the moisture levels. So there's the technology starting to come around to alleviate those issues, but I just can see these getting worse and worse over time. That's just the reality. You put heavy equipment on soil. It's like if you walked across your garden every single day, or you like drove your truck on your garden, 3 times a year, eventually, and you didn't use a rototiller after. I mean, it's gonna get hard. It's what happens. But I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this creepy crawly episode. I know quite a few of you asked for this when I was asking for ideas on creepy crawly videos. If you guys have any ideas of what you want to see in the future, please leave those in the comments below. I will talk to you guys next time. Bye.